Hello.
What are your impressions after the G7 summit in Brussels? What conclusions can we draw from that?
Well, nothing dramatic.
Are you disappointed?
Not at all. I think the G7 drifted away from the traditional G8 agenda, of course, focusing on totally different issues. Whereupon the G8 agenda, formulated by the current Russian presidency of the G8, was sidelined. But
because Russia was not there.
Of course. And the G7 chose to discuss totally different issues. So I wouldn't mix the G7 with the G8 at this point.
So it's a totally different event for you.
It is.
Then how would you...
Hardly impressive.
Hardly impressive, we know. Mm-hmm. But how would you assess the logic of not inviting Russia in Brussels and inviting Russia the following day at the D-Day commemorations in Normandy?
Well, you should ask those who sent out the invitations, of course. Let me clarify this, I would say, organizational side of events. Russia was never part of the G7. The moment Russia was invited, G7 became G8, 17 or something years ago. Whereas the D-Day commemorations would have looked ridiculous without Russia being there.
As for the claims that founded the non-invitation of Russia to G7, we know that Russia does not admit that there is an involvement in Ukraine. Among the recriminations against Russia is the fact we know that there are no Russians in Ukraine, there's no military involvement.
There are many Russians living in Ukraine. There are many Ukrainians living in Russia.
But we don't have Russian guerrillas in Ukraine, we know this. But how about the other recrimination that Russia applies different measures when it sells gas to Ukraine and when it sells gas to other countries? Why is Russia applying different tariffs to foes and friends?
Well, you know, we're not speaking about tariffs. Tariffs is something that exists internally in each country. What we are probably talking about is gas prices. And gas prices, as prices for any commodity, they are subject to negotiations between companies, the company that sells the gas and the company that buys the gas.
But the Russian state has a huge stake in Gazprom.
51%.
So it's a political decision.
On prices, no.
No, it's a market decision.
No, it's a market decision. Of course, every deal in energy also involves taxes, both on the supplying side, also on the consuming side. And I will not reveal any secret if I say that up to 70% of the end price that a European customer pays for gas in this part of Europe goes to the state coffers of his country as taxes. 70%.
In this case, the country being Ukraine. Will Russia recognize officially the new president of Ukraine?
Well, you're not the first person asking me this question, and I'm a bit puzzled because what do you imply by official recognition? The Russian ambassador went back to Kiev. He participated in the inauguration ceremony. What else would you expect?
An official announcement?
Nobody, countries recognize each other. They do not recognize governments or presidents.
So you're not bothered by having someone in power in Kiev that wants to claim back Crimea?
Well, everyone is entitled to make mistakes.
How about NATO? What is Russia's position towards NATO's promises to Georgia and even veiled promises to Ukraine in some areas?
Well, I think that NATO eastward expansion is an unhealthy process. be it the countries that you just mentioned or any other countries, including those that have already joined. We believe that NATO expansion, in principle, is an attempt to address security challenges of the 21st century with means dating back to the mid-20th century, and means, I will add, devised in totally different historical circumstances and for totally different reasons.
Did NATO infringe any of its promises in the 90s? Did NATO promise formally that they would not expand in Eastern Europe?
Well, not NATO as such, but major Western countries did. They, for example, promised to the first and last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, that NATO infrastructure will not move to Eastern Germany, the then German Democratic Republic. It has. And a lot of other promises.
And not sending troops to Eastern Europe? And
yes, yeah.
But Russia did a similar promise in '99 in the summit in Istanbul, when it said that it will pull out its troops from Transnistria. And
I was there. So
you made the promise?
No. It was, of course, President Yeltsin at the time. But let me explain. It was not a promise. It was a commitment to do that, subject to certain conditions. And those conditions were followed up by the Porto Declaration of the OSCE in 2002, which spelled out, provided necessary conditions are in place. They are not there.
What were
actually,
the
in practical terms, Russian military presence does not have any significant military significance. I can explain in a few words the background.
Yeah, please.
After the events in Central and Eastern Europe,
you mean the fall of communism?
I mean the changeover of governments and the subsequent pull-out of the then Soviet forces and their stockpiles. Some of them ended up in that part of Europe. So what is now referred to as Transnistria housed a number of, huge amounts, huge stockpiles of munitions. Not actually arms as such, but munitions. Some of them dating back to pre-World War II period. Like
so in a bad state.
Like bullets that would not fit any modern gun, and too dangerous to transport. So we contemplated various options, including destroying them on the ground under international supervision. Germany provided actually some equipment to do that. There were, of course, protests by local residents who said this is bad for environment, and they had a point there. So some, more than half of these stockpiles were eventually moved out. But I don't think it would have been in anybody's interest to leave those stockpiles unattended, unguarded. So that was the main reason why a little over 1,000 Russian troops stayed to guard those stockpiles. Plus, of course, a peacekeeping contingent, which is there on the basis of a multilateral agreement between the authorities of the Republic of Moldova and the authorities of Transnistria, upon consent of both parties. But that's a very small number.
There is talk now about a referendum in Transnistria, about independence or union with Russia.
Well, they already had several of those.
Would Russia accept such a referendum? Would Russia take this country like it did South Ossetia or Abkhazia or Crimea?
You know, the last time a referendum was held in Transnistria, if my memory doesn't fail me, was 2006. which was a response to a law enacted in Moldova the year before, 2005. The law which actually downgraded the status of Transnistria to just a geographical notion without any autonomous rights or anything. What is Russia's position? We are in favor of a peaceful resolution of this conflict on the basis of Transnistria being part of a federal, neutral, non-aligned country of Moldova. And we are very actively pursuing the 5+2 dialogue on this, multilateral dialogue on this issue. The latest round having taken place, I think, last week.
Speaking of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the only countries that recognize the independence of those entities are Russia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and the island of Nauru in the Pacific.
And a few others.
Which ones?
Some other Pacific islands.
Some other Pacific islands?
Yes.
Doesn't sound very impressive.
So far, no, yes.
Isn't this a failure of Russian diplomacy?
No. You know, after the Bolshevik revolution, for 15 years almost, the country survived without being recognized, and it survived. Today there are some countries that are either totally unrecognized or recognized by one single country, or recognized, I mean, entities recognized.
Let's say Taiwan, for instance.
Or the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, for that matter. Actually, in the latter case, there was a UN Security Council resolution urging UN member states not to recognize, specifically not to recognize. There was nothing of the sort in the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Well, I can also refer to Kosovo, which has not been even recognized by all EU member states.
Yeah, 5 countries don't recognize it.
Yes, as is the majority of countries across the world.
Right. Let's stay in Russia. I suppose you are often asked about some laws that make Russia kind of a scarecrow in political and diplomatic and cultural terms, like the law about the NGOs being foreign tools, tools of foreign interference. How do you explain this? How do you dilute the impact of this?
Yeah, foreign agents.
Foreign agents.
Well,
exactly.
the term foreign agents applied to NGOs is not a Russian invention. It was invented in the United States of America, and the law, which dates back, of course, to 1930s, is still in force. So, you know how many Western NGOs are active in Russia?
No. How many?
About 3,000. How many Russian NGOs are able to work in Western Europe and the United States?
Do you have any?
Yes, 2 in the United States, 6 all over in Western Europe. And when one of those applied to be registered in France, they had to fulfill a questionnaire of over 100 questions. And in the similar case in the United States, the list was even much longer. It's, it's a bureaucratic procedure.
A tit for tat.
No, there is nothing political in that. Nobody is preventing any NGO in Russia from receiving financial support from abroad. But if that NGO is dealing with political issues, then it has to register. It has to inform the authorities that it is receiving financial assistance from abroad. If it's dealing with humanitarian issues, like medical assistance or assisting children or anything like that, there's no need even to register.
So it's not a measure of reprisal?
No.
Another thing that scares here and worries people is the Eurasian ideology.
Well, we are not afraid of people pursuing Euro-Atlantic ideology. Why should anyone be afraid of Russia pursuing Eurasian ideology? It's just a geographical term.
Could you resume it in a few
Or
words?
is it something else?
Well, we could already say
I mean
that
Euro-Atlantic.
we could already say that the Eurasian ideology has nothing to do with communism, first of all, because it
Yes.
was devised
Yeah.
by some white Russians emigrated to the West, including figures like Trubetskoy, who was a very highly praised linguist and intellectual. So it's not to be attached with Stalinism or the Soviet ideology. But how would you describe it in a few words?
Well, if we speak about philosophy of the
Political philosophy.
of the notion,
Political philosophy.
it's something different if from whether we speak about practical actions.
So it's
like
about the identity of Russia.
It's about I would say the integral elements of what we all know as European civilization. In our view, which I personally fully share, is that European civilization today rests on three pillars. You know this EU speak, the pillars.
Yeah.
So one pillar is Europe as such, the other pillar is Russia, and the third pillar is North America, which is so closely connected with the first two. So these three pillars of European civilization need to interact, and they need mutual support to, well, I wouldn't say survive, but to retain their role in today's multipolar and globalized world.
And what is Asian there? Why Eurasian?
Well, you know that two-thirds, well, you worked in Russia, you know that two-thirds of Russia lies in Asia. And of course,
But here we speak in symbolic terms, not geographical. In political and symbolic terms.
I think something that is grossly underestimated in this part of Europe is the historical achievement of my ancestors, those Russians who lived in the 17th and 18th century, who succeeded in expanding the boundaries of what we today know as European civilization to the Pacific coast, to the borders of China. I will probably stop here without asking you a hypothetical question. Which language would have otherwise be spoken across Siberia today?
Mongol.
I don't know.
Do you think
But
that...
I think you should be happy that it's Russian.
But Russians were for centuries under the Mongol yoke, as you call it.
Yeah, a couple of centuries.
A couple of centuries. Do you think the West doesn't realize, doesn't understand the strength and the power of your breaking free from this yoke and in Russians...
among many other things that unfortunately the West fails to understand.
So the West is ungrateful for Russia for having, in a way, saved Europe from external invasions.
That too, yes.
And how can you convince them of this by let them have the impression that you invade a European country?
Which one?
Ukraine.
Well, we did not invade anybody. If you are referring to Crimea, Russian troops have been there for over 2 centuries. And after
It's the major Russian naval base in the Black Sea.
Yeah. Which I would say has a lot of symbolic significance, perhaps more symbolic than strategic, but still, and the Russian Navy was there since Ukrainian independence on the basis of a bilateral agreement, a series of bilateral agreements. So there has been a lot of speculation about the certain surge in numbers during the dramatic events in the beginning of this year. But that was also fully in conformity with those agreements. Because, well, again, I won't reveal any secret if I say the ceiling for troop numbers was 25,000 written in those agreements. And the actual numbers when this turmoil in Ukraine started was 16,000. So this gap of 9,000 was filled. We never denied that.
To stay in the field of cultural and political influence of Russia in Europe, of course you have a long cultural history, literature, music, painting, everything. Today, when Russia is seen rather as a foe in Europe, by some, the only direct political influence you have is on some far-right parties. We had a couple of days ago a meeting.
Many left parties too.
And many left parties, but fringe parties, extremist parties. And there was a meeting in Vienna.
Some of those fringe parties actually won the European elections.
They won them in their countries, but
yes.
On a Europe-wide scale, they are still a minority.
Yes.
So Russia is approaching some of these extremist fringe parties, and there was a meeting in Vienna a couple of days ago.
We are not approaching them.
They are approaching us.
And we are open-minded to everybody, except, of course, parties and political groups professing, fascist, Nazist ideology, including those in Ukraine.
So you feel that Russia is excluded from what it would deserve?
No.
You said
we are not excluded.
European civilization is based on 3 pillars.
We are understated.
You would like to be on the same level as the United States and Europe as a whole, and Russia as a 3rd pillar.
I think it's in everybody's interest.
And are you optimistic? How do you see this?
I am a born optimist. That's why I chose this job.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chizhov. We had with us Vladimir Chizhov, Russia's ambassador to the EU. I am Dan Alexe. We are in the New Europe studios on Plage Jourdan. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.